Good evening, all. Philosopher Prince here, and tonight I am going to be doing an analysis of Meditations Book 2, which I've recently uploaded. So if you haven't already had a listen, I would encourage you to do so. This video will make a lot more sense. And I think from the last analysis I did, most of you probably realize that when I do these, I don't have it pre-written. I do sort of jot down a few notes about what I've read, but it's not, none of it's planned. It's most of it's off the top of my head. I feel it gives it a more natural flow, and it's sort of a more honest discussion of a lot of the things that Marcus wrote about and how it applies practically in real life. Um, One of the notes that is at the top of this particular book, it says this particular book was written among the Quadi on the River Gran. For you historians out there, that may or may not interest you. Um, I think the pretty cool part about that is the fact that most of these books, as I've said in the last video, we actually don't know where or when most of these were written. We assume most were written towards the end of his life, but we don't even necessarily know what order. We just know it's quite a beautiful collection of books that he put together, and even more so the fact that he didn't intend anyone else to read it but himself. And we know that because of the way that he wrote it. So this book, it's the second book, but it's the book where we do start to get into a lot of the ideals of Stoicism. As I said in the last video, if you don't know what Stoicism is, I would recommend looking into it, but very much so about, accepting what is, doing the best you can, living life in the present moment, not worrying about the past, not stressing about the future, knowing that really they're both an illusion. We only have the now, and to make the most of the now to be a good person, and not stressing about external influences like other people, you know, circumstances, things like that. So I think so. When in the beginning of the book, it starts off, and it's quite sort of a jarring opening when you sort of think about a lot of advice and sort of self-help books written today. Um, it says basically to expect to bump into people who are going to be aggressive, to be difficult, treacherous, malicious, basically bad people. I think a lot of in this day and age, a lot of like advice given, it's quite airy-fairy. It's, um, put out the positive energy in the universe, and you won't walk into um, negative people. But this is quite realistic. It's not saying to that there's a possibility you're going to bump into these kind of people. It's saying expect it. These people are around. Nothing that you do is going to change that. Um, Not necessarily embrace it, but be prepared for it. It's going to happen. It's a very off day if you don't bump into people like this. And the way it talks about it is accepting it. Um, I don't think it necessarily talks about it here, but in other areas of meditations, it does talk about if you can try to change them, try to do so. Not so much here. It's an acceptance, and to help, I guess, empathize with these kinds of people, it talks about good and evil. And this is a very common theme in the meditations and even Stoicism, in that when people are good, it's because they have a knowledge of what good is. And when people aren't good, or when they're evil, it's because they don't know what good is. Um, Basically saying that anyone evil isn't meaning to be, it's just they don't know what good is, which is an interesting way of looking at it. I think you could probably have a debate on both sides. I think there's probably a lot of people, that you could say, just evil because they are selfish or whatnot. But I guess the other counter argument of that is, well, they're evil because they don't know what being good is. um, they think that good for them is the selfish means to ends, that their own self-pleasure and whatnot. But Marcus, sort of puts this in a way that these people are ignorant, And just as, someone who may not be very smart is ignorant, we shouldn't hate them, but more so pity them, if anything. Um, and I think, just an obvious um, strivance to not be that way, to always remind yourself what good is and to be learned, to not be ignorant and to not be evil, obviously. He then goes on to talk about the directing mind, which again is something that does come up very often in the meditations. The ancient Greeks and something in philosophy, they would talk a lot about, the elements, and I think even a lot of cultures did this where they would apply parts of the body to different elements. I think most have applied the human flesh to earth, and in this circumstance, I believe the ancient Greeks would say that the breath that we breathe is the air, the element of air, and our mind is the fire that sort of draws the whole process, that keeps us alive. Talks about the directing mind, and the directing mind is something, it is going to come up a lot more in the meditations, but it's essentially our will, our ability to think for ourselves, to reason, to be a good person. And what's not so much talked about here, but a little bit, but more so, is mentioned the fact that, whilst external influences can always harm the body, the directing mind, the mind itself, shouldn't be harmed. I think back in those days there wasn't as much of an understanding of mental illness, um, so that sort of really made a lot more sense back then. And I think it is still obviously practical for today too, without obviously neglecting to think about mental illness. But I think just in everyday life, there are obviously things that stress us out, and without sort of putting a completely cold outlook on it. Um, but I think for the most part, a lot of the things that we stress about or get upset about, if we just sort of think about it in a different way, it can help us a lot in dealing with these issues. Um, a lot of different motives in here. Marcus talks about, accepting what is. Um, if it can be changed, change it. If it can't, as you see, like he talks a lot about the gods, and you can see he's quite a religious man. He talks about fate. He talks about, things being part of a bigger picture, which I think for some people it can help. To sort of have a look at the other side of the coin, a lot of people, some people believe in providence or fate, and others believe in chaos, and some people might believe in a combination of the two. But essentially, what it comes down to, no side can prove with certainty that their argument or their school of thought is the correct one. But I think in this sort of mind state or belief in fate, that everything that happens for a reason, I think that does help a lot of people sort of deal with different things, but also understanding that, these things that are going to happen, they're going to happen. You can control what you can control, but you also have to accept at the end of the day. And I feel like that's regardless of whether you believe in chaos or fate or something else entirely. You know, it is what it is. If you don't accept it, it's just going to drive you crazy. Marcus also talks a lot about, the present moment, the fact that we really don't have anything but the present moment. The past has happened, but really it only should be used to act today, to learn from those mistakes or those experiences and to act today. It really doesn't exist anymore, the past. The future, I mean, it could be argued the future does exist, but we don't know if we're going to experience that future. We don't know when our time will have come. So the present moment is the most important, and we should always act as if it is all that we have. Marcus talks a lot about, applying oneself at all times, completing your duty, living a good life in accordance with nature. He does talk a lot about in this chapter as well as throughout the whole book of Meditations that, um, whatever you're doing, you must do your duty to its best. He talks a lot. He uses a lot of animal imagery, not so much here, but there are books where he mentions, the bees that make the honey and the birds that fly in the air, they're all doing their job. So as a man, a Roman, he was a human like us. I'm sure he felt lazy at times, but in order to sort of motivate himself, he would say you need to do your duty, and to do it to the best of its ability. It's irrelevant how much longer you have left. You should always do your best job and live in accordance with nature. And interesting about the reference to nature, he many times throughout the meditations sometimes uses interchangeably the terms universe, nature, the whole, God, or gods. They're kind of used interchangeably, and it's interesting the way it's done. As I said, he was obviously a religious man. He believed in the gods. He believed the gods were good, but that doesn't stop him at times bringing up the fact that what if the possibility that they don't exist? Um, and in those circumstances, he says, if the gods don't exist, then what is life? That was his belief. I wouldn't go so far as saying that, but I think in another part, I don't want to keep referencing other parts of meditations, but there was another part of meditations where he mentions the fact that um, even if it is a completely chaotic universe and there is no order to it, that doesn't mean you yourself, as a member of that, need not have order, which was quite inspiring. To sort of look at, I've jotted down some notes as I mentioned. I'll try not to sort of go through all of them, but he talks a lot about external distractions, sort of mentioned that before, where there are things in life that will annoy you. Um, and also, obviously, the simple things of pleasure and pain. These, obviously, I think drive most people. I think most people would be crazy if they didn't. But he sees value in not being influenced by them. I think this can make you truly independent and truly unfazed by a lot of things in the world. People who chase pleasure all the time, if you're always chasing something like that, does it truly make you happy? Um, and pain as well. I mean, to avoid a life of pain, some of the greatest things in life involve pain. Relationships, fitness, being healthy, um, studying, working hard. Pain is involved, but in order to, reap the fruits, you do need to experience that pain. And I mean, that could be argued it's in the pursuit of pleasure too. But I mean, I think there's more to it than that. To sort of do your duty, which Marcus talks about a lot. Do your duty, try to be good, which could involve providing for others. Um, Again, another point of, others, outside influences, and this includes people that cannot control you. So just have, faith in the fact that you have your mind, and that's something that no matter who it is, they cannot force you to do evil, which is essentially the crux of Marcus's main beliefs, is the fact that you have your mind, and the fact that no one can force you to do evil is good enough. They can harm your body, but they can't force you to do evil. They can't force you to go against your nature. An interesting chapter in this also, where that sort of comparison of anger and lust, I found quite interesting. I'd never sort of really thought about it that way. The fact that anger was more an impulse, but lust was something more inside. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that. I mean, I'd probably say they're quite similar, and neither are obviously good. I don't know if some people think they are or not, but I mean, yeah, interesting. Never really thought about that. It gave me sort of pause to think, but I'd say they're both sort of on the same level. I wouldn't say anger's better or worse. Um, and the book comes to an end speaking about death, and I think this was when I read this for the first time and reading about it, it kind of was interesting. I mean, it's so simple in how it's worded, but it's kind of true about, death. I think we kind of not we don't always think about death, but when we do, it's something that we don't sort of take pleasure in. But Marcus compares death to any other part of life, birth, puberty, maybe entering a relationship. It's not something that should be feared because it's just part of the process. If we think about before we were alive, we were quote unquote dead. We weren't alive, but do we remember pain back then? We don't remember anything back then. We have absolutely no memory. There's obviously sadness in thinking about death and the fact that we won't see our loved ones, but you won't know, or that's what Marcus believes. Marcus, throughout meditations, it's uncertain what Marcus thought happens after death. It's thought he did believe something would happen, but he wasn't 100% sure. I think like a lot of people aren't. Um, and towards the end, um, this quote, "All is as thinking makes it so." Again, very, very simple. Um, this is something, the first time I read it, it made absolutely no sense to me. And I read it like 6 times, and I thought, am I not smart? I do not know what he means by this. It kind of speaks for itself, really, which is that anything that we think is good or bad is completely up to us. And if we see something as bad, it's going to be bad in our perception, but we don't have to see it as bad. We can choose how we want to view something. And Marcus sort of supports looking at most things as neutral. The external things, he calls them indifferent. They're neither good nor bad. And he talks about here, both good and bad men experiencing these external things, wealth, poverty, fame, infamy, um, uh, suffering, pleasure. And it's something I think I've thought about a lot before reading Meditations, and a lot of other people probably thought, is the fact that I'd thought for ages, some really bad people get away with some hideous things and they seem to live, lives quite, you know, comfortable lives, get away with bad things, and the kinds of people we're thinking about. Um, and then some good people do not get away with good things, or rather, sorry, some good people get punished for things they didn't do, or they suffer, or they have an illness. But Marcus says, these are things, and this was written 2,000 years ago. I found this so amazing when I read it, is the fact that we look at these things as good or bad, but they're not in themselves good or bad. They're externals. They can happen to anyone. To view it as good or bad is the mistake. They just happen. Um, and sometimes a bad thing can happen. You can turn it into a positive. You might not get the job you wanted, and it might be that the next job's even better, or your girlfriend dumps you and turns out she wasn't as great a person as you thought she was, and the next relationship's better, or you learn from these things. So to call them good or evil is a mistake in itself. And this is one of the many things that Marcus points out, is that these external things, to look at them in and of themselves as good or evil, is wrong.